Some Harry Potter chapters are action packed. This is not one of those, but it is packed full of foreshadowing. Hi, and welcome to Belated Binge Harry Potter, the podcast that doesn't take itself or the books too seriously. I'm Zach, your host, and I didn't read this series till my mid 20s, and now I'm here so that you can relive your favorite books as an adult with an affinity for sarcasm. Today, we pick back up with Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 11, The Firebolt.
The Belated Binge Podcast.
Before we start, spoilers, obviously. Language, definitely. Oh, definitely. Shout out to the bonus binge squad on Patreon, patreon.com/belatedbinge if you want to get in on that fun. Shout outs in the episodes, access to bonus episodes, other cool benefits that are there, early access to the episodes. Basically, I record them and I put them onto Patreon. And then that's when patrons get them. So yeah, check it out. Before we get into this particular chapter, though, it has been a while since we've done a Harry Potter chapter on this podcast. So I thought it might be a pretty good idea to reset where we left off in the story. So, in case you were obliviated or you got your Hogwarts letter late, let us shove our faces into that white liquidy substance of our pensive. To this point in the book, we have learned that Harry Potter is a special wizard boy. He lives with his abusive aunt and uncle who hate him, but somehow not as much as his uncle's sister Marge, who is a gigantic piece of shit. At the end of her visit, she pushed Harry a little bit too far, talking shit about his parents, and he accidentally turned her into a human hot air balloon. And then he ran away. Luckily, the purple bus of plot convenience picked him up and brought him to the Leaky Cauldron, where the magical minister of plot convenience happened to be looking for him in that exact moment in time. Harry gets to hang out in an all-wizard village called Diagon Alley with a hotel room, all by himself, with no direct supervision for the rest of the summer, because there's an escaped convicted murderer wizard man named Sirius Black who's on the loose and wants to add Harry to his body count. He was even able to elude Azkaban guards, which is a term that's only used in this book up until the point where we, as the reader, learn that they're actually called Dementors, and nobody ever uses the term Azkaban guard again, because stupid writing. We learn what they're called when they stop the Hogwarts Express on its way to school and they suck the happiness out of everyone on the train and the consciousness out of Harry, who hears his mom screaming in his head and passes out when he's near them, which is very unpleasant. Once at school, he's disappointed that he's not able to go to an all-wizard village called Hogsmeade with a giant group of classmates and witnesses because he didn't get a signed permission slip, and there's a murderer trying to get him. Everywhere he goes, it seems that someone's telling him or predicting that he's going to die, or they're making fun of him. We are also reminded that Quidditch is life when Harry nearly falls to his death from 50 feet in the air and his broom blows right into the Whomping Willow, the murder tree. And luckily, Fred and George come through in the clutch to hook him up with a way to sneak into Hogsmeade anyways, all by himself, when they give him the Marauder's map, which helped him to be present for one of the biggest plot conveniences in the history of literature, when he hid under a table and listened to the Minister of Magic telling a bartender all about the Sirius Black murder case, how he betrayed the Potters in extreme detail, and all about how he was the best friend of James, and what else did he say? The details about the case and what they found with Peter Pettigrew, only one finger, that's it. He was there, and all of this stuff while he's drinking at the bar with Professor McGonagall, Professor Flitwick, and Hagrid, of all people, because that group obviously hangs out on the weekends. And oh, by the way, Sirius Black is Harry's godfather. And now you are sufficiently up to speed with at least how up to speed Harry is in this particular story so that we can jump into Priori Incan chapter, where our wands connect, not the tips, just the streams, so that we can recap what went down in the chapter that we just read this week, chapter 11, the Firebolt. In this chapter, Harry gets back to school in a daze. Kind of like when you get up at 3:30 in the morning to go to work and you're pretty sure that you fell asleep at some point along the drive because you've been driving for like an hour and suddenly become aware that you're almost there, but you can't remember how you got there. Maybe I'm speaking from a little bit of experience, but I imagine that that's what he's feeling like because he's spiraling mentally because of the whole Sirius Black was his dad's best friend and his own godfather thing. He was the best man at Lily and James's wedding. And now, knowing a little bit more about them and him, Harry was able to open his little photo album book that Hagrid gave him at the end of his first year and found pictures of his parents and Sirius at their wedding. And he's doing the thing where he starts to wonder if Sirius Black was already planning or had already been betraying them at that point. Like he's doing that that thing where you see a moment in time in knowing the later outcome and you kind of wonder, was it already unfolding or was he uh still their friend? Was he still loyal? Was he still a loved member of the group at that point in time? Or had he already started to go the other way and was he a mole? You know, was he a spy? Wild. And he's 13, by the way. So this is kind of a lot to handle mentally. He brings up in his head the part of the conversation where Fudge said that the Dementors don't affect Sirius Black, which is a foreshadow that we're going to learn more about later. Naturally, he didn't sleep much after all of this went down. Luckily, the trio are basically the only kids staying at Hogwarts during the Christmas break, so they get to talk openly about it when he gets up at like noon, straight up teenager hours. Don't sleep all night, fall asleep around 5, 6 in the morning, and then sleep till noon. And then you wake up kind of looking like a zombie. Yeah, Harry's doing that, which seems about right because like I mentioned, he's 13. But they get to talk openly like they couldn't the day before because everybody was still there. The common room was super crowded. That's why he snuck up to bed early and all of that anyways. And Hermione and Ron are worried about Harry going after Sirius Black, which is what the adults were worried about earlier in the book too. Remember how many times essentially he's had to say the words, "Why would I go after someone who wants to kill me?" That bit. He does, however, tell them about hearing his mother screaming and pleading with Voldemort as she's about to be murdered every time the Dementors get close to him. And it seems pretty healthy. Not what's actually happening, but that he's finally saying that, getting that off his chest a little bit to his friends. And Ron also gives us some foreshadowing during this back and forth about how the biggest bit of Peter Pettigrew they found was his finger. By the way, we're going to have to recap all the foreshadowing that happens in this chapter. Good Lord. It is foreshadowed abound. Harry brings up how Draco knew that this was the case with him being his godfather, or at least being the one that betrayed them. And he stews on that for a little bit. Shout out to the Drury fans, particularly the ones that have been commenting on that YouTube video that I made. I made this random YouTube video about who Harry could have wound up with romantically if it wasn't Ginny. I did not expect it to do the things that it's done, but it's gone kind of hog wild a little bit in the YouTube world. And there have been a lot of people in that comments section telling me about how he and Draco should have ended up together. So shout out to those people. And if you want to go watch that video, go ahead and watch it. But, wait till this episode is over. They break up the fun discussion that they're having to go visit Hagrid, where Harry intends to interrogate him about never telling him this detail about Sirius Black and his father and all of that. But when they get down there, they find him crying his eyes out. He had gotten a letter from the Ministry of Magic that he's not in trouble for the Buckbeak thing. You know, remember when Buckbeak smacked the shit out of Draco like a little bitch? That incident? Yeah. But there is going to be a hearing with the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures Committee, I believe is what they were called, about whether Buckbeak should get, murdered or not. And there's two things about this that I want to say before we move past it, because I just find it a bit odd. First is Hagrid, was literally just with the Minister for Magic yesterday, the prior day. Uno day, just a handful of hours, one sleep before this moment. Chumming it up, drinking away in Hogsmeade like a couple of good old pals. Just ignoring the fact that last time we saw these two together, just 1 year before this, Fudge was showing up to put Hagrid in Azkaban, to look like he was doing something about the Chamber of Secrets. That whole mess. But Fudge had no idea that this letter was coming to Hagrid the very next morning to the place where he was going to be hanging out that day. Now, you can tell me, and I would believe you, that the Minister for Magic is too important for something like this and doesn't know every single hearing or, case that is being, I guess, deliberated or whatever within the ministry. The head of whatever government branch doesn't know everything that's happening in that government. Clearly. Why would they? But in this particular case, Fudge ends up being the witness to the execution later. So he, at least by that point, ends up being aware. And I don't think it's a stretch to think that he's at least seen this. And particularly, I think it's reasonable to think that if there's an open case of any kind against a teacher at Hogwarts, he's going to be aware of that case before he goes to Hogwarts, and certainly before he goes out drinking at the bar with the teacher whose case is pending. Am I crazy? I'm just saying he could have given him a little heads up. That's all. He had no problem giving the bartender all of the juicy details of a murder conviction about Sirius Black. Maybe could have let Hagrid know that there was some stuff going on with the Buckbeak thing. The other thing is that Hagrid says in this exchange that the whole disposal department of magical creatures, or whatever it's called again, is in Malfoy's pocket, and that they're afraid of him. Leading me to ask the question, is this just a thing that the Malfoys enjoy doing? Having magical creatures killed? Draco just absolutely gets off on this for like the entire book. He pretends his arm is hurt when it isn't. He talks shit about how he and his dad are going to make sure that Buckbeak gets killed, like constantly. And unfortunately, in this very moment, I can't remember if it's a movieism or if it's also exactly like this in the book, but he wants to watch the execution happen. And if Hagrid is so familiar with this group that they're in with Lucius Malfoy, how often is this happening? And how often is it a creature that Hagrid cares for? Otherwise, how does he know this information? And why does he know this information? And why would this be a thing at all? I get that the Malfoys are power trip people, so it could just be that. But it seems very odd that they both seem to have this weird fetish about influencing the bureaucracy that oversees the lives and death of animals. It's a fucking weird detail. At least Harry wasn't enough of a dickhead to use this time to dig into Hagrid about Sirius Black. Instead, we've got the trio on the case. We're going to get a hippogriff off. Ew. Hagrid tells them about what it's like being locked up in Azkaban. And that, I think, is worth digging into a little bit deeper. So we're going to do that in the Lumos segment of this episode here in just a little bit, because it's pretty dark. And I think it serves a purpose, not just in the moment, but also narratively. After their visit, the trio does some library research to try to help Hagrid with said case because Google doesn't exist. They have to go to the library and read books. Books, like real books. And then Christmas, because remember, it's the holiday break. That's why they're all the only ones that are at the castle, because it's Christmas and most kids go home at Christmas because they actually like their families. But Harry doesn't, and Ron and Hermione are there for Harry. Harry gets presents. Sometimes I'm still shocked that that's a thing that happens. But Ron's mom is awesome and makes sure that Harry gets presents, and they're thoughtful presents. You know, he gets like a sweater with a lion on it because Gryffindor, and some other stuff they said, I think pie, treats, I don't know. I didn't write all of that down because the other thing that he got was a brand new broom. It's a Firebolt, the title of our chapter. And it's the fancy top of the line broom that he was having wet dreams about earlier in the book when he was in that hotel room in that all wizard village by himself at 13 years old with no direct adult supervision at all, with a killer on the loose that wanted to murder him. That part, you know, he would go to the broom store and stare at this thing for like hours on end every day. And now he has one. And Harry and Ron are playing the game of who bought me this crazy expensive gift? You know, we've all played that game before, right? Right? We get some more foreshadowing about Lupin before Hermione walks in and is put off by the mystery broom gift. And this ends up being a topic that is a bit divisive among the core trio here in just a little bit. We've got that interrupted though, so the payoff is coming later. Hermione's just kind of cold about the broom, and there's what is the? It's like Crookshanks on Scabbers' attempted violence that's been happening on and off throughout the book so far, and the commotion knocks the sneakoscope out of Harry's bag, the sneakoscope that Ron bought for him when he was in Egypt and sent it to him for his birthday. And they've been thinking that the thing is broken because, you know, it was going off when at dinner or whatever Ron talked about in his letter. And it's been seemingly kind of just going off at random times. But here's some more foreshadowing. They haven't been random. Big shock. They describe how rough Scabbers is looking, though. And Ron calls it out as stress. It's the stress getting to him because Crookshanks is always trying to murder him. And who wouldn't be stressed if there was a killer cat trying to kill you all the time? If someone was always trying to murder you, wouldn't you be stressed out? Harry? Anyways, Ron's mostly correct about this. Of course, they are missing the context of Sirius Black being the one that's actually after him, and Crookshanks is just the sidekick. After the commotion, though, there's saltiness, there's side eye, and there's Harry stroking his new giant wood broom, and they go down to lunch with the handful of people still at Hogwarts, and This gives us the scene that a lot of people bring up when they talk about Trelawney, kind of in the aftermath and reflecting on the series, and how often her random, ridiculous predictions that are played off as just she's a fraud, many of them actually end up being accurate and true, and nobody believes her because, well, she carries herself like a fraud. Um, but in this case, this is the one where she makes a big deal about not wanting to sit at the same table as them at lunchtime, because she says if she sits down, there will be 13 people at that table, and whoever stands up first will be first to die, because she's always about predicting people's deaths, and that's why people think she's a fraud. She's always doing this nonsense. I think I just smacked the microphone. That was probably good for the audio listeners, or maybe you didn't notice at all, and now I've called it out for no good reason. This is a thing that producers get mad at for show hosts doing all the time, but since I'm both, I just do what I want. Uh, so the reason that people have gotten into this moment and into this scene is because they have cited, technically correctly, that Scabbers is currently in Ron's pocket, aka Peter Pettigrew. And so there were actually already 13 people sitting at that table. So when Dumbledore stands up in this exchange, he actually ends up being the first person to die. So while she doesn't know it, because she thinks she's number 13, and she freaks out when Harry and Ron stand up at the same time, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, which one of you died first or is gonna die first?" And it's like, "Ha ha ha, fraud." Um, there was already a 13th wizard at the table in Ron's pocket because, again, grown man, young boy's pocket. This is the kind of nerd shit that makes the nerds in this fandom such great nerds. Just saying. Throughout all of this, Professor McGonagall is not a fan of Trelawney, and she makes a couple of snarky comments, more foreshadowing that happens during all of this. But it is really funny to listen to her basically call Trelawney out for being a fraud. And there's more foreshadowing during lunch about Lupin's potion. And there's more foreshadowing about how Hermione's taking all these classes after she stays behind to talk to Professor McGonagall, and Ron and Harry are talking about it. And just when they get back to the common room, and all Harry wants to do is polish his big old giant broomstick, and Ron wants to help, the thing happens. Hermione and Professor McGonagall walk in on them touching the wood. I have to stop. I have to stop with those. They're both caressing the firebolt together. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just that's what was written in the text. Professor McGonagall takes away the broom and wants to examine it for jinxes. And Harry gets all sputtery like a kid whose favorite toy's being taken away from him. And of course, they're super pissed at Hermione, who's red in the face about it and hiding behind a book. And that is the chapter. Like I said, all in all, there's not a lot going on here, but there is a shit ton of foreshadowing. So we're going to go through those. And this is just by my count. If you counted more things than this in your read, then kudos to you. Let me know what I missed. Join the Facebook group for listeners of the podcast, and you can sound off in there about how dumb I was because I didn't catch every single one that you caught. These are the ones that I caught. 1, the Dementors don't affect Sirius, which is how he kept his mind while he was there and didn't go crazy like the rest of the prisoners do, and hence, was cognizant enough and aware of his self, his inner self enough to actually be able to escape. 2, The only thing that they found of Peter Pettigrew, or the biggest thing that they found, was a finger, which is how he convinced everyone that he was dead and why Scabbers is missing a toe. It's also the big reason that Sirius was able to recognize him in the Daily Prophet that convinced him to escape and get to Hogwarts and save Harry from him in the first place. Now, it was, I say, the biggest reason. He also is very aware of what Peter Pettigrew looks like as a rat, but it's kind of like the confirmation of having a missing toe. 3. Lupin was sick during Harry's last Quidditch match, but Ron was in the hospital wing and Lupin wasn't there. Obviously, suggesting that there's something strange about whatever Lupin's illness is, kind of like as if there's no illness that exists in which someone would want to avoid a large crowd of people outside in a storm if they're not hospitalized. But nonetheless, still foreshadowing. The next one is the pocket sneakoscope that Ron got Harry for his birthday. When it starts going off when Crookshanks goes after Scabbers. A hint that there are shenanigans afoot. And in this case, Scabbers actually being a 30-something-year-old wizard disguised as a rat, which should have been a foreshadow to the Marauders of who the rat was in their group and who the rat from their group would later be. Seriously, Wolfie McWolferson and the loyal dog couldn't figure out who might have had the character of a rat. I guess. Oh, and bonus foreshadowing about how old Scabbers is and how he would need to have special powers that they didn't know about to keep living much longer. Sure does, Harry. More foreshadowing. I mentioned the thing where Dumbledore stands up at the table before Trelawney sat down and ends up being the one that dies first. Sure. But the main foreshadow at lunch is just the Lupin clues and how Trelawney says that he won't be with them very long, which we know ends up being because he resigns at the end of the year after going all werewolf on the grounds, which is not very safe when there are children present. And Dumbledore is already aware of this, because there's still a curse on the Defense Against the Dark Arts position. So he's going to have to be out of that position somehow before next year. So yeah, not going to be with you very long. Dumbledore also foreshadows in his response the potion that Snape has been making for Lupin because of his illness, the Wolfsbane potion. More foreshadowing. Ron making a snide comment about Hermione wanting to talk to Professor McGonagall. He says it's probably about taking more classes, which is a hint to the Time Turner because that's how she's been taking all of these classes and the answer to that mystery that they've been trying to solve all year long. And finally, Hermione thinking that Sirius Black sent the Firebolt is less foreshadowing and more just a correct assumption by the character. She doesn't, however, know that he's a good guy and not using it as a murder tactic. That is all the foreshadowing that I noticed in this chapter, which seems like a lot of foreshadowing. How'd I do? Before we move on, I would like to ask you to leave a 5-star rating and review in the podcast player that you are using right now. It does truly help the show. And if you're on YouTube, like the video. Same request. That leads us to the next part of our show, which is the Lumos section, the part where we light our wand tips and illuminate a character from the chapter. We're going to go with Hagrid. Like I mentioned earlier, this is really kind of an interesting part, not just for the chapter itself. Also, I have something to give him a little bit of shit about, but it is also, I think, doing some work narratively for the book. And this is when he's telling the kids about what it's like to be locked up in Azkaban, which is just a common thing that you typically talk about with children when you're a grown-ass adult and their teacher. Totally. He talks about how being surrounded by Dementors all the time makes you replay all of the worst memories in your head. And he even goes as far as to say that he would go to sleep at night hoping that he would just die instead of waking up. Again, something you often tell children. But here are the memories that he brings up, and this is the thing that I want to give him a little bit of shit for. The first memory, being expelled from Hogwarts. That makes sense. He was framed for murder, after all. And in this world, getting expelled from school also comes with a lifetime sentence of no magic because they break your wand in half. Well, for Hagrid, they do that. It doesn't seem to have been the case for Newt Scamander or Gellert Grindelwald. Fred and George Weasley just quit school in their final year, and they certainly get to keep theirs. That must be something completely different. But for Hagrid, no school meant no wand, and it being illegal for him to do magic for the rest of his life. We can set aside the logic to that, but that does seem like it would be worthy of one of your worst memories to relive. Makes sense to me. The next one that he brings up is the day that his dad died. I don't have to describe why that makes sense in the category of worst memories of your life. Moving on. The third one. The third worst memory of his life that he said. The day he had to let Norbert go. The baby fucking dragon that he wasn't supposed to have in the first place. The baby fucking dragon that bit and poisoned Ron. The baby fucking dragon that Harry and Hermione got caught smuggling out of the castle for him and led to the detention that Harry was nearly murdered by Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest because of. If the centaur plot armor had not shown up and saved his ass, he'd probably be dead because of this baby fucking dragon. And Hagrid puts losing that baby fucking dragon on the same list as being exiled from magic and the death of the only parent in his life. Fucking Hagrid. Okay, he also uses this time to explain that that's why he doesn't want to let Buckbeak go. Because not only can you not tell a wild animal that he needs to go into hiding, which, by the way, do you think that the Ministry of Magic, like, tagged Buckbeak or somehow, like, checked his markings of some sort? Like, if Hagrid just took Buckbeak out to the other wild hippogriffs that live in the forest, because there were more in that class, could a single person, Draco included, even pick out the right one aside from him and maybe Harry because he wrote it? Anyone? Maybe, but alas, we'll put aside that part of it. He is correct that you can't really explain to a wild animal that it needs to go into hiding and not get caught. But he talks about them knowing that it would be him, and he's afraid to break the law because he's scared to go back to Azkaban. And that's the part that carries some weight here, because Hagrid doesn't have a problem breaking rules. At least not to that point, he didn't. But after his Azkaban experience, he's afraid to even just let a hippogriff go in case they think that that is a bad enough offense to put him back in prison. The like drive you mental kind of prison. Ultimately, it's really a pathway for us as a reader to get more explanation of why Azkaban is so bad, so that it stays in our brain and can stay relevant throughout the book. The author wants us to feel what Azkaban is like, how horrible it is, how horrible the Dementors are, so that it raises the stakes of the big reveal and the climax later, to make it more impressive that Sirius escaped at all, to make it scary for him to have to go back, giving the whole thing more stakes. Stakes for Pettigrew, stakes for Remus and Sirius, for Hermione and Harry. And for the scene at the lake when the Dementors attack Harry and Sirius, this is part of what makes that weight felt. This book is called The Prisoner of Azkaban. And for that to truly matter, we have to actually give a shit and be afraid of Azkaban. And what better way to do that than by showing us how one of the biggest physically, strongest physically characters in this entire book series crumbles to pieces at the thought of going back. Now, let's give out some house points from this chapter. In true Hogwarts fashion, these points are completely subjective, with no oversight, and fully at my discretion. This week, I'm going to give some house points to Sirius Black. We don't know it yet, but he just gave Harry the dopest present ever. And it's also not meant to kill him, which is a good bonus. He is going to get 50 points for that. I'm also giving points to Hermione for being someone who is more concerned with her friend's safety than if that same friend is mad at her. When she expresses her concern to Professor McGonagall and her suspicion that Black is the one, indeed, who did send the broom. 20 points to Hermione. Professor McGonagall is also getting some points for just simply being highly entertaining and calling Trelawney on her bullshit all throughout that lunch. It was great. I enjoyed it. 5 points, Professor McGonagall. The same as, defeating a mountain troll. Now I'm going to take away some points from Ron for being a dick to Hermione about Crookshanks and the Firebolt. 10 points for each offense. I'm going to take away some points from Hagrid here too. He didn't do anything wrong, but he is a grown-ass man and seems to always need to lean on these children to take care of him. And some of the stuff he said was disturbing to be sharing with said children. Minus 5 points. The last points I'm going to be taking away from characters are from Draco and Lucius Malfoy both. They aren't directly in the chapter, but their actions are what cause the entire Buckbeak storyline in the first place. And their weird fetish for hurting animals sucks ass. So I am taking away 100 points from each of these creepy bastards. Before we go, we need to expecto plot changeo rewrite Harry Potter one small change at a time. The expecto plot changeo question from this chapter is, what if Hagrid did the adult thing and didn't involve the trio in his problems? How could that have changed the events in the chapter or the book or the series? I'll give you my initial thoughts on this one here. Would Harry and Hermione even be aware of the appeal and execution at all? So if they weren't, how would the end of this book play out? You can share your thoughts on any social media platform. I think I've got them all at Belated Binge. You can use the comment section if you are on YouTube, and you can join the free Facebook group for listeners of the podcast that there is a link in the show notes for, and let me know what you think on any of those things. With that, we have reached the end of this episode of Belated Binge. If you enjoyed it, please follow, subscribe, whatever podcast player that you're using right now. And if it does support a rating and review option, once again, please leave one. If you're so inclined, check out the additional benefits available on patreon.com/belatedbinge. Thanks for listening, and tell all your Potterhead friends their new favorite podcast should be Belated Binge Harry Potter.